Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and in this video we're going to take a look at how to create a simple 2D card game using Unity. If you haven't used Unity before, I highly recommend checking out my other video called Take a Tour of Unity. I'll link it in the description section and at the end of this video so that you can look at some of the different features that we'll be using here in this 2D card game. And I should also mention that we're not using every feature that comes with Unity for 2D game development. For example, we won't be using much of the physics engine, we won't be using the animator for anything, but this tutorial will give you an example of how to do things like dragging and dropping items on the canvas layer. It will focus on some scripting in C#, which will give you an overview of how to do some things in Unity. And if you don't already have a C# background, I also highly recommend brushing up on your C# so that you have some of the basics and will understand some of the things that I'm doing here from a C# perspective. Although I will explain each thing that I do, each script that I implement using Visual Studio. As you can see here, we just have a completely blank slate. I'm using Unity 2019.2.15 F1 Personal. You might be using a different version of Unity, but by and large, the things that we'll work with today will be pretty similar. I also have Visual Studio installed as the code editor that we'll be using for our C# scripts. I highly recommend that if you haven't installed Visual Studio, go ahead and do that, and also install the Unity tools for Visual Studio, as they will make your quality of life that much easier when you're writing your scripts for all the things that we're going to do today. So we have this blank slate, and I'm just going to start by giving you an overview of what we're attempting to accomplish in this video. We want to have a 2D card game. For right now, it'll just be a single player card game where we'll have a canvas that will serve as a background for the card game, almost like we have a tabletop that has an area for me to be dealt a hand of cards and an area for you to be dealt a hand of cards, so two hand areas. We'll want a drop zone right in the middle where we can drop cards. We'll want a button or some sort of way that we can tell the computer that we want it to deal us a hand of cards, and that will represent the basic structure or architecture of our card game. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is, right now I'm on the game scene in the editor, and I want to switch over to the scene or the scene tab so that I can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to go up to Game Object. The Game Object menu is one place that you'll spend a lot of your time. And I'm just going to scroll down to UI and create a canvas. As you can see, that populates a canvas right in my hierarchy here on the left-hand side, and it also displays information about the canvas in the inspector. And I'm going to just right-click and drag here so that I can see the canvas that's being created. I might have to scroll out as well, as the canvas is it looks quite big in my current view, and now I can see the entire canvas just like that. And if I click play, that'll automatically take me over to the game tab, and there's nothing going on here. This is just the standard Unity background, which is a light blue. So I want to create a background that looks like a tabletop. So what I'm going to do is go over to Game Object again and scroll down to UI. And I'm going to create an image. And what that will do is just drop this square image right in the middle of my canvas. You'll see also on the left-hand side in the hierarchy that it has nested the image underneath the canvas as a child of the canvas, which is what we want. I'm going to drag this over to the corner here and then use the sizing tool to just make it snap to the entirety of the canvas. If you're having trouble with that, or if that's not working for some reason, take a look to make sure that you have this tool, the rect tool, selected, which will allow you to change the size of the image. And if you're having issues with your snapping settings, like it's not snapping correctly, you can find those under Edit, Snap Settings, and then you can change these as you see fit. So I've created that image as my background, and I'm actually just going to click on it, or you can right click and rename it. We'll name it something like background. And if I click play now, I got this nice white background. So we're playing in the snow, And just for fun, I'm going to change the color of this background to black, like a black tabletop. The way that I do that is I want to make sure that I've selected the background either in the scene view or in the hierarchy. Right now I've actually selected the canvas, so let me select the background. I'll click on this color palette, and then if you have a color code in mind, like you could enter that, but right now I'm just going to drag this guy all the way down to here so that it looks like I have a black background, and if I press play, it shows that I have done that successfully. So yay us. Okay, so that's our tabletop for this basic game. Now I'm going to add 2 areas, one for my hand, or where my hand is going to be dealt, and one where the opponent's hand or your hand is going to be dealt. We'll call that the just for nomenclature, we'll call it the player area and the opponent area for now. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do the same thing I did before and create an image, and I'm going to drag it down here to the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to drag it across and then drag it up a little bit more. Maybe let's say this is a quarter of the screen, and that'll be my hand area. And I'm actually going to change the color of this to, I'm really into cyberpunk, as you would know if you've seen any of my videos, so I'm gonna create a nice cyberpunk blue color here. Maybe, yeah, that's almost like a little cyan. A little bit darker, that's perfect, just like that. And then I'm going to, what I'll do here is I'll change the name of this to be called player area, and I'll right click on this and I'll hit duplicate, and I'll rename the new object that's created into let's say enemy area. I know I said opponent area, but this feels more combative, and we're making a competitive card game, let's say. So let's just call that enemy area. I'm going to drag that up. It should snap to the grid up here, and now I have 2 areas. And I'm going to, let's say I'm just going to recolor this to be a nice cyberpunk hot pink. Yeah, just like that. Perfect. Cool. Very good. So I got a player area and an enemy area, and I'm going to do something funny now. I'm going to go down to this project tab, which we haven't talked about before. This is essentially a file system for you to organize things as you see fit. I'm going to use one convention. You don't have to use that if your desktop is totally messy and you just have a method to your madness. Like, go ahead with that. But for me, I like to keep organized. So right now in the assets folder, I just have this scenes folder. So I'm going to create a new folder by right clicking and hitting create folder. I'm going to call that Prefabs. I'm going to double click in that folder, and I'm going to drag each of these things, the background, the player area, and the enemy area, into that folder, into this tab. And what that does is it creates a prefab of each of those areas that I can use later on, or whenever I need them, to populate instances of that object in the game as I see fit. So it's kind of like creating a cookie cutter of something rather than having to make each of those cookies, the shapes of those cookies, every time that I want to have a cookie. So like, let's say you were making a platformer and you wanted to create a bunch of monsters. Well, you could create, and let's say all of these monsters have 6 arms. Well, you could create like a bunch of monsters as we just did, or you could create one monster that has all the 6 arms that you want it to have, and all of the properties that you want it to have, and then create it as a, drag it down to create a prefab out of it. And then you can create objects from that prefab, or create monsters from that prefab that have the 6 arms and the 10 eyes or whatever it is that you want, without having to make the same changes to every object. So like, let's say later on you have created that monster with 6 arms, and you decide that like 2 of them should have 8 arms instead of 6 arms. Well, you can just use the same prefab and then make changes to that one, to those 2 objects, rather than having to do that and edit a bunch of different objects one after the other. So we're going to use prefabs pretty extensively in this tutorial, so it's good to have an idea about what they're used for. We have these these three objects under our canvas: the background, the player area, and the enemy area. Something else that we need is a card, or some image of a card that we can use to drag around and essentially play our game. I'm going to do exactly the same thing, and you'll see me do this. Go to the game object menu and go to UI, but you could also just right click here or right click on an element to make an object. There are many ways of doing things in Unity. I'm just giving you one way so that it's easier to wrap your head around. Unity, as I'm sure you've encountered, can offer you so many options and so many ways of doing things, and often they're nested within a lot of different menus that it might sometimes be easier just to be told one way to do them, and then later on, when you're comfortable with the editor and you feel like you've onboarded to the way it wants you to work, then you can investigate and see if you have a better way that works for you in a more streamlined fashion. For now, we're just going to go up to game object. We're going to create a UI element, another image, and we're going to call this image card1. And this little square thing that doesn't really look like a card to me. So I'm just going to go into the transform here, and I already have an idea from working with Unity for a while about what I want this to look like. So I'm just going to give you a little cheat here. I want it to be 120 units in width and let's say 177 in height, and that kind of looks like a card to me. I don't know, your mileage might vary, but for me that looks pretty good. And if you have a sprite already, like you're an artist or an artist has created a sprite for you, you could just attach it to this object and that'll work just fine instead of this rectangular image. Right now we just want something that we can work with. I'm going to change the color of this to something a little bit more exciting. Let's make it like a really ugly cyberpunk yellow sort of green sort of thing, and we'll call that card1. And so yeah, so that looks like it stands out against the background, it stands out against the hand areas, and that looks pretty good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, and I'll make another card called card2. You can make as many of these as you want or need. And for card2, I'm going to change this to an angry red color. Yeah, just like that, like an angry tuna red. Okay, and I'm going to drag both of these to the project tab so that I have prefabs of them. And then something that's important about that we want to note early on is that the prefabs are living here in this project folder, and the cards, so like they still exist, we can use them, we can call for them when we need them, but I don't need those cards on the table when I start the game. I actually don't want them on the screen. I want the player area and the enemy area there, so I'm going to leave that in them in the hierarchy. But once I've created prefabs of these cards, I don't actually need them on the screen anymore, so I'm going to leave that alone. Now that we've got our playing board and we also have the cards that we're going to use, and of course we just have two cards, but they will serve as examples for what we're going to do here. I also need a way of dealing cards and a way to tell the computer that says, hey, I want you to deal cards for me now. So I'm going to create another game object, and this is also UI. You'll notice that most of the things that we're doing here are just in the canvas or the UI elements of Unity. We're not dealing with other aspects of 2D and definitely not 3D game development here. So I'm going to go to UI. I'm going to use button, and I'm going to drag this button over to the side. And I want this button to be a different color. I want it to be let's say I want it to be a similar color to this cyberpunk blue thing. Actually, instead of clicking on this, I could, instead of clicking on this field next to the color field, I can just click on this eyedropper, and then you can see the color field changes based on the position of my mouse. I'm just going to put it right over this area, and that shows up in the color field, and that will change the button to the appropriate the appropriate color. And you might notice that there's, although there are a lot of components here in the inspector when I click on the button, there's the transform, the canvas renderer, there's an image, and the button itself, which we'll work with later. I don't see the text. That's because when you create a button in Unity, it automatically populates a child of that button, which is the text. So I'm going to click on the text in the hierarchy, and I'm going to change the text to draw cards. You could change the font and the alignment and stuff if you wanted to. We're not going to do that right now. If I hit play and I click draw cards, well, nothing happens because we haven't done anything. So that's essentially what our game board is going to look like. We're going to need to do a little bit more with it later, but for now, that's all we need to do. Okay, let's move to the idea that when I click on this draw cards button, I want it to draw cards, and for that, I'm going to need to add a script. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I've clicked on the button object and not the text object, and I'm going to click add component, and I'm going to search for script, and it'll say new script, and I'm going to call this script draw cards, just so I remember what it's called. And you'll be like, okay, where exactly did that go? I don't see it anywhere. And then it'll populate as a component on that object. I can go back to my assets folder here in the project tab, and that's where that script lives. I'm going to create a new folder called scripts, drag that script over to the scripts folder, and if I double click in there, I have my draw card script. I'm going to double click on that, and that'll open Visual Studio. Okay, so when you create a new script in Unity, it's automatically going to populate a bunch of boilerplate code for you, specifically the namespaces up at top, and then most of our work is going to be done here in this public class draw cards mono behavior. This is essentially, when you create a script, it essentially creates a C# class for you. And ordinarily, it creates two functions or methods for you. One is the start method, and the other one is the update method. You can see here that they've commented that the start method is called before the first frame update. Essentially, when an object exists in the game, that's when the start method is called. And then the update method is called once per frame. So you could kind of conceptualize it as it's checking all the time whether or not it should be doing something in the update method. We'll work with that in just a moment. In this particular script, we won't be using the update method at all because we just want to check what's happening when we actually click the button. So I'm just going to delete this to clean it up a little bit. I'll delete this comment because I'm OCD. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to create a couple of things here. We're going to create two parts of two public game objects. The first one, excuse me, is going to be a public game object that's called card1, a public game object that's called card2, a public game object that's called player area, and a public game object that's called enemy area. Okay. And the reason why we're declaring them as public is because if I save this and I go back into the editor, I see that when I go back to this button, remember the script is the draw card script is attached to the button. It exposes in the editor, in the inspector, these public game objects. So I'm basically telling Unity through this script, I'm saying, hey, there are these 4 game objects that exist out in the world somewhere, and I'm going to tell you where they are so we can connect the dots, because we're going to be using them later. And so when I see these things, you can see they say none, and they're expecting you to place a game object on top of them. I can click this like little button next to them, next to this field, and it'll bring up this little dialog box that allows me to select a game object. Or something that I like to do, which is at least for me a little bit easier, is I'll just drag and drop them. And here's a good place for us to talk more about prefabs. Essentially, I'm telling Unity there are these two cards that exist as objects, and when I reference them in the script, I'm talking about those game objects, or these game objects, and I'm talking about the prefabs that exist, saying that, like, I want you. We'll see this later, but I'm basically going to say, hey Unity, create new versions of these two cards. Create a card 1 and create a card 2 in my game, because they don't currently exist in my game. They're just prefabs. They're assets that live elsewhere. But when I reference this player area and the enemy area, I'm not talking about their prefabs. I want you to actually do something with the ones that are on the screen. I want you to use this player area that exists over here and this enemy area that exists over here. These specific ones that are already instantiated when the game starts, not their prefabs. For the cards, which they don't exist in the game when the game starts, I want you to instantiate or create versions of cards from these, or duplicates of the cards from these prefabs. So I'm dragging the prefabs of the cards to these two fields, whereas I'm dragging the actual objects in my hierarchy to these other two fields. Okay, so that's the purpose of declaring a public game object. Now, in the there's another aspect of this that we need to we will need to figure out if we want to understand how to randomize and draw cards. But right now, we're just gonna make it a little bit easier on ourselves, and we're gonna say we're gonna create a different method here below the start method, and we're gonna call it public void on click. You can name it whatever you like. And inside of this method, we're going to say game object player card equals instantiate card 1 at a new vector 3. And the great thing about using the tools, the Visual Studio tools for Unity, is that Visual Studio will use IntelliSense, which is their like sort of autocomplete function. So it gives you an indication of where what you should be typing and what kind of parameters you should be using, and you can always like just mouse over stuff to get more ideas. Like if I mouse over a game object, it says, well, this is the base class for all entities in Unity scenes. Or if I mouse over instantiate, it gives me an idea of what the syntax should be when I'm creating something. So if you're stuck, or if you don't remember what you should be, what your code should look like, it can give you a little bit of a boost up. But right now, I'm going to instantiate this card 1 at a new vector 3, and the properties of which are at the origin 0, and it's going to have no rotation. And I'll explain what this means in just a moment. So essentially what we're saying is that on this onClick function, in this onClick function or method, I want to create a new game object, a private game object called player card, and I want to set that equal to the instantiation, or the creation of a new object. So this player card, I'm instantiating a new object, and that object, its value should be creating an instance of this card 1 game object, the public game object that we've attached here in the editor. So I'm basically saying this new method called onClick, I want you to create a new version of this card 1 from this card 1 prefab. And then the syntax of this, essentially the Unity, it requires you to say, well, where do you want that object to live? And I'm saying, well, I want you to create a new vector 3, and I want that to be at the origin at 0, 0, 0, and I have an incorrect comma here, which is why I have this little squiggly line down here. And then Unity also requires you to declare whether or not it has any form of rotation. And this final parameter, quater9.identity, essentially says I don't want it to have any rotation. We're not using that for our objects here. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to go back to the editor, and I'm not quite ready to go yet because I haven't said, I've created that in the script, but I haven't told the button that that's what I want you to do when I click it. I definitely called it on click, but that's not good enough for Unity. You need to actually explain to Unity in the editor exactly what you want it to do. So you're going to make sure that you have this button selected. You're going to go down to this button script, and you'll see this on click field that says list is empty. You're going to add to that list. And you'll see, well, there's no function or no method that you can use here because this might drive you crazy as it does drive me crazy. You need to actually drag an object that has the script that you want to reference onto this field, which kind of makes no sense to me, but I mean, I understand why it is done that way, but it still drives me crazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this button onto itself into this field, and basically that allows Unity to access this script that's attached to this button, which we're already working with. So who knows? Once I do that, you'll see that there's a drop down now that I'm able to select from. I'm going to select draw cards, which is the name of our script, and then I'm going to look for the on click function that we declared, this one over here. And I'm essentially what I've told Unity is that when I click this button, I want you to use this on click function. And then when I click play, I click draw cards, and nothing happens. I don't see anything happening. Well, look over here on the hierarchy. What we have right now is this card 1 clone, and if I click it again, it'll happen again. I'm creating all these game objects from my prefab, and but I'm not seeing them on the screen. If I click over to my scene tab, and then I select my card 1 clone, or any one of them, they exist somewhere in the game, like at the origin where we told them to be, but I can't see them. And that's because they're not nested under the canvas layer, which is what we, under the canvas object, which is what we need to be able to see the cards that we're instantiating. So we have a little bit more work to do. I'm going to click play again to stop the game, and then I'll go back over to my script. So what we've done is we've successfully instantiated the object, but we need to nest it under something else in the canvas layer so that we can actually see the object. So what we're going to do is we're going to say player card dot transform dot set parent player area dot transform, and we'll say false. What this means is that when you say player card dot transform, every game object, or at least to my knowledge, every game object in Unity has a property called transform, which essentially means where the card lives, where it should be, and other properties above it. And we're saying we want to set its parent to be the player area transform. So this is a long-winded way of saying that when we instantiate this player card object, we want to set it as a child of this player area game object that we declared earlier and connected the dots with in the editor. And then you just have to say false at the end of this because that's part of the set parent method. Okay, so now when I do it, I'm going to click play, and I'm going to hit draw cards, and we see that right here, right in the middle of the play area. And then I should be able to say, instead of just doing this once, I should be able to write a for loop and say for declare a variable I equals 0, and while, oops, we don't want that, while I is less than 5, and we increment I, then I'm going to just cut and paste right in the middle here, saying basically 5 times I want you to execute this code. I'll save it, and I'll click play, and I'll hit draw cards, well, I still just instantiated one of them. But if I go over to this player area object here in my hierarchy, and I click on this little arrow, I've actually instantiated 5 objects, but they're all on top of each other because the player area is just an image. It doesn't. It's not allowing me to see all of the images that I'm instantiating, or all of the cards that I'm instantiating on top of it in an interesting and like card behavior fashion. So I need to do a little bit more work this time in the editor. Okay, so just to recap, we created a script where we exposed these 4 game objects, which we then connected the dots with here on the component, the script component on the button. We created a method called onClick that will instantiate 5 cards for us and set them as children to the player area, and we connected the dots with that by dragging the button object onto this onClick field here on the button itself, and then we selected that draw cards method here under this drop down. And that's all working well and good, but I need something else that's going to help me to make everything just work the way that I want it to, and that means I need to add a grid layout group here and also here on top, so that I'm able to draw 5 cards and have them placed side by side as I would if I were holding them in my hand. This is actually pretty easy to do, and we're going to do that for both areas. So what I'm going to do here is I've selected my player area, or actually what I probably want to do is select the prefab. So if I had multiple of these areas, it would affect all of the prefabs. I'm sorry, all of the objects that we would be using. I'm going to hit add component, and I'm going to look for grid layout group. Add that, and I've done some work on the back end to just figure out what we need for this project. You might need something different, so feel free to tinker around with this. I'm just going to skip ahead so that you can get an example of how this could work. I'm going to change the cell size to the same size of the cards that we made, so that'll be 120 units on the x-axis and 177 on the y-axis. I'm going to have 20 units of spacing in between them on the x-axis. I want the start corner to be the lower left. Lower left. I want the start axis to be vertical. The child alignment to be on the middle center, and the constraint to be a fixed row count, and the constraint count to be 1. We'll see why that is in just a moment. So I've done that, and then I note that because I've changed the prefab, it's also changed it here in the object. It's cascaded down to the object. When I click play and I click draw cards, we'll see that now it's populated all 5 cards again, but now it's populated in a grid so that I can see them distinguished from one another. If you want to mess with this, you could keep the game going and then select this object, and then you could say, like, I want to have more space in between them. I want to have 100 units of measurement between them, or I want them to the children to be aligned to the upper left. So you could do a lot of tinkering here to make it suit your needs. Right now we'll just keep it as is. And then because I've done that to the bottom one, I also want to do to the top one, to the enemy area. And this is where we might see that it's beneficial to us to actually make all the changes that we have to a certain type of object. Make everything that you want that is in common between 2 types of objects, and then create prefabs, because now I'm doubling back and I have to do the same work. So I could have added a grid to the hand area before duplicating it and then creating an enemy area out of it. But that's more for us in our learning process, in the process of demonstrating this in this video, so that I can also show you that if you, instead of making changes to a prefab here, you could click on the enemy area object in your hierarchy, add a component, add a grid layout group. We'll make the same changes here, 120 and 177 as the size. We want 20 units of spacing. We want the start corner to be the lower left. We want the start axis to be vertical. Everything's the same here. Middle center for the child alignment, and fixed row count as the constraint, and we want just one row. So we've done that. Now this hasn't been applied to the prefab. This is just for this singular object here. So if I go over here to this the top of the inspector and I click overrides, you'll see that Unity will alert me that we've added a grid layout script, grid layout group to the object, and that this hasn't been applied to the prefab. So I can just click apply all, and then now if I go to the prefab, I see that it exists here as well. Great. Okay, so now we have our grids. We have a little bit more work to do in script because we want not only on the in the onClick function do we not only want the player cards to be instantiated on the player area. We also want to do that on the enemy area. So I can I'm doing this specifically because I want to divide the two cards up into two different types of cards. Otherwise, there are many different ways of doing this, but I want to distinguish between my player cards and my enemy cards. So I'm just going to declare another private variable called a game object enemy card, and I want to do the same thing here. I want to instantiate them using card 1. Let's say actually we want to do card 2 just for the sake of color here. And I want them to instantiate at a new vector 3 at the origin with no rotation. And I want the enemy card transform to be set as a child of the enemy area. Transform. Okay. Save that. Go back to my game. Click play. Draw cards, and now I have 3 green cards here and 3 red cards up here. So yeah, so that's working pretty good. Well, let's add one more piece to this. Let's say that I don't want to just hand out the same cards to myself and the same cards to the opponent. Actually, I want to mix it up, and let's say we're both drawing from decks of cards that are randomized. Well, we can do that very easily by using a list here back in the same script. I'm going to create a private list, and this is just we're just using the C# syntax that Unity uses, so this might look a little funny if you haven't used a list before. We're going to call this list cards, and we're going to set that equal to a new list that the type of it will be of a game objects. And then in the start method, meaning like when this when the game starts and a button is created, I want to add to this cards list card 1 and also card 2. So we create a private list that takes an object, that takes the type of game object, and we're going to call this cards, and at the beginning of the game we're going to add card 1 and card 2 to that list. So essentially when this button is created, it will have card 1 and card 2 in that list. And then when we instantiate an object called player card, and we do this 5 times each for player cards and enemy cards, instead of instantiating the same card, I actually want to instantiate them randomly from the cards list. So in here I'm going to replace card 1 with cards, and then a random dot range Basically, the index is going to be a random range, and that range is going to be between 0 and cards.count. And I'll save that. I'm just going to copy that and replace the card 2 down here with that as well. Okay. So what does this mean? This means in the cards list, I want to select a random index, a random number within that that list, and that should be that the range of that will be between 0 and the number of things in that list. And once I've selected a random number, then I want to, which could be 1 or it could be card 1 or it could be card 2, then I want to instantiate one of those. And I do that for both my player card and my enemy card. That means that now when I click play and I click draw cards, I get a random assortment in both in my hand and also in the opponent's hand. So that tells me that I've done my work correctly here and I've instantiated these cards correctly. All right, so now we're going to deal with the dragging and dropping of our cards, which is where things might get a little bit hairy. I've done extensive research to figure out the best way of doing this for a 2D card game. And there are many different ways of doing this and a lot of different scripts and methods that will show you ways of doing this. This is the most elegant way that I've found and the simplest way, so it may seem a little bit complex, but it for me at least, it is a bit more straightforward than what you'll find out there. You can even download a template from, I think it's on the Unity Essentials. I don't know exactly like what it's meant to tell you, but it's let's just say that it's super complex, the way that they handle drag and drop from like an official Unity perspective. It certainly was more than I needed for the types of card games and prototypes that I'm making. So I mean, it's worth downloading from the asset store and seeing what, you know, where it takes you and whether or not it informs how you want to do your drag and drop. But for me, it was just too much for my purposes. So this is one way of doing it, and just keep in mind that there are many ways of doing it. This is the easiest one that I found. So I'm just going to stop the game for now, and what we need to think about is what we want this to look like. Well, I need to attach a script to my cards that allows the computer to detect when I click on one, and then when I drag it, and then when I drop it. And I want certain behaviors to happen when I do those things. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my my card, let's say card 1. And again, this is why it's easier to just like, if all your cards are going to have drag and drop, we'll create your prefab from just this one base card that does everything you want it to do, and then you can change things later on. Because right now I'll have to do this I'll have to attach the same script to 2 different cards, but you know, that's fine. I'm going to add a component, a new script, and I'm going to call it drag drop. Pretty straightforward. And then I'll go into my assets folder and drag and drop this into my scripts folder. And then I'll open this. And you will recall that we have this start and update methods that are already here. Actually, in this one, I don't need the start method, but I will use the update method to detect user input. And I'm just going to start simple and create a private Boolean, which can be true or false, and it's going to be called isDragging. And I'm going to make that false to start with, because the card is not being dragged anywhere. And then the next thing I'm going to do is create, under the update method, I'm going to create a public void. Well, that doesn't look like public at all. Public void start drag. And I'm going to do something funny. I'm going to say start position equals transform dot position. And I get this squiggly line here which I'd like you to see because it will tell you that the name start position does not exist in the current context. That just means that, well, you haven't told me what start position is, so like what am I supposed to do with that information? So what I need to do up here before the rest of my code, I need to declare a private vector2 variable called start position. And then Visual Studio will be happy. We'll talk about why I'm doing this in just a moment. But also under the start drag function or method, I will say that is dragging equals true. Okay, so that's basically going to be the basis of saying that, like, all right, when we call this start drag method, we want the start position, this new variable or vector2, to be equal to the transform position. Again, like I said, we'll talk about that in a moment. And we want to change the Boolean is dragging to true. In the update method, meaning which is called once per frame, which for our purposes is basically all the time, we want to say that if is dragging, which is shorthand for saying if is dragging is true, transform position should be equal to a new vector2 and vector2 takes two values, an x and a y coordinate. We want that to be equal to input.mouse position .x, and the y will be input.mouse position .y. Save it. Okay, so that just means that every frame I want the computer to check if is dragging is true. And is dragging is true when this start drag method is called. And if is dragging is true, I want the transform position. And remember, the transform.position, or just saying transform, it references the object or the transform of the object which this script is attached to. So right now, this script is attached to card1. So I want I'm essentially telling Unity through Visual Studio that the transform position of the card, or of card1, I want to change that to a new vector2, which is equal to my mouse position. That's a long way of saying, hey, if is dragging is true, move the position of this object to wherever my mouse is, wherever the pointer is. And then I'm going to declare a public void ndrag, and I'm going to say is dragging equals false, and just leave it at that for now. We'll come back to this. Okay, so what I now need to do is go into my editor, and I'll click on card1. I have this drag drop script, and I don't see anywhere that I can actually apply any of the stuff that I just did. So what I need to do is add an event trigger. Event trigger. Okay, and you'll see that it adds this little component, and we can add a new event type. And we want to add two event types. One is begin drag, and the other one is end drag. And that essentially says when Unity detects that I'm beginning to drag this object, I should do this, and when I end dragging this object, I should do this other thing. So the list says list is empty, so I'm going to add something. Like we did with the button, I need to drag this card1 game object over to this field, onto itself essentially, and then I will select the drag drop script, which is attached to it, and I will click start drag, which is this method that we declared. And then for the end drag, I will add to this list by dragging the same game object over to it, and I will select the drag drop script, and I will use the end drag function. I guess you could call this begin drag and end drag or whatever you like. But now these the script that is attached to this game object has been dragged onto itself so that we can access the methods that we need to use. And now when I click play, I'll draw cards. And this follows me around, which is pretty cool. So what you can't really see is I'm clicking, I'm beginning to drag. When I drag, it follows my mouse pointer. And then when I let it go, when I let it drop, then or I let go of the mouse pointer, it stops dragging, which is awesome. There's a little bit of tinkering that needs to be done with the hierarchy of how these things are displayed, because as you can see, when I drag this, it goes under the draw cards button and it goes under the enemy area. That's beyond the scope of this video. I'll give you an idea how to do that with our drop zone that we're about to use, but suffice it to say that the script that we're using allows me to click, drag an object on the canvas, and then drop it, and then it recognizes what I'm supposed to do, which is great. There's one missing component here, which is where things get a little bit hairy, is that right now I'm able to just drag and like drop stuff anywhere, but you might have a different purpose in your card game. You might say that like, well, once they actually drop something, they shouldn't be able to pick it up again. They should have a drop zone where they can drop their cards in the middle of the screen, and then once they do that, they're not able to pick them up again. So we're going to create that now. We're going to go back and to this player area, and we're going to do the same thing we did before to create the enemy area, and we're going to call this drop zone. And we're going to drag it up here, like right in the middle of the screen, just like that. We'll change its color to, let's make the ugliest game that we can. We'll change it to this like banana yellow sort of thing. And then as you can see, it's covered the button. So I'm going to drag the button lower than the drop zone, and that will, when you do that in the hierarchy, it'll appear in this way. Okay, and then we already have a grid layout here. We already have all the other things that we need. The only thing that we've done here is to change the color, and as you can see, is the color is now bolded, which means this is different from the prefab, because the Unity thinks that we're using the same prefab as the player area. We've just changed the name of it and the color, and I could override that, but I don't really want to do that here because I want to create a different prefab from this. So I'm going to drag this back onto the project tab, and it says, would you like to create a new original prefab or a variant of this prefab? And I say, no, this is a new thing. I want to create an original prefab. So then now I have a drop zone prefab. Okay, and then let's just say that there are ways to let Unity know that when I drag a card around the screen, I shouldn't be able to drop it just anywhere. I should only be able to drop it in a drop zone, and I want that drop zone to be this thing right here. There are many ways to do that, and we're going to use one way, which is by using colliders, which just barely dips our toes into the 2D physics system of Unity, but we're really not going to do very much in it. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fix my script so that it says everything that I need before working with the editor. So I'm going to go back to my script, and you'll just have to take a little bit of this at my word until you see it in action. So we're going to create another private Boolean called is over drop zone and make that equal to false. And then we're going to create a private game object drop zone. Okay, so just basically preparing our code for later. And then we're going to go to our ndrag function. We're going to change the script to say, actually I want to leave is dragging up at the top here. We're going to go below this this line of code, and we're going to say if is over drop zone, which is that Boolean, which is currently false, transform dot set parent drop zone dot transform, and false. And if not, else transform dot position equals start position. And now all is right with the world because we're using this start position. So if we look back at this earlier code, we're saying that that when we start dragging something, we want to log this start position. We want to say wherever the card started, wherever its transform position is, we want to store that into this start position variable. And then when we end drag, we're saying that if it's over a drop zone, change its transform to set it as a child of whatever the drop zone is. And if it's not over that drop zone, well, return it to the start position, this one that we logged up here. We're essentially saying that if we're not over a drop zone, just return it where it came from, because we don't want it to be able to be dropped anywhere else. Now we need to go back to the editor to add a few components to our cards and to our drop zone. The first thing we have to add to our, and you might scratch your head at this as I did as well, but this is just the way that it works. There might be a better way of doing this, but for me, this has just been the way to make it work with the behavior that I want it to. I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to add a component here, and remember, I'm on the card 1 prefab here. I'm going to add a box collider 2D. And I'm going to add a rigid body 2D. If you've worked with the Unity physics system at all, you'll be familiar with these two components. But a box collider basically allows Unity to detect when there's a collision between two objects, and a rigid body allows us to apply physics to those objects. So the first thing that I'm going to do here, and again, I've done a little bit of work behind the scenes to get all this stuff right, is that I'm going to double click on this this card 1 prefab, and I'm going to click on the edit collider, and you can't really see it, but there's this like tiny like little button here that I can like drag and drop, and usually I'll do it wrong. So you can see like I'm dragging this thing, and then it goes back to just selecting the object, and it's just a little bit finicky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the size of this to something more acceptable, which is essentially 120 by 177, the same size of my my game object. It is not in the right place, so I'm going to change the offset to 0, 0. And then if I click on Edit Collider again, you'll see that it's exactly matched with the size of my my game object. Essentially, we're telling Unity the shape of the collider is exactly the same as my game object. And then I'll go back down to this rigid body component, and everything's all right here. I want to keep this as the body type dynamic. There's no material for it. It is simulated. I'm going to set the mass to 1 as it is. I want there to be no linear drag or angular drag. I don't want it to operate using gravity. Collision detection should be continuous. Sleeping mode is okay for it to start awake, no interpolation. And I need to add some constraints here that sometimes when you're working with Unity, it'll do weird things like your card will start to rotate or it starts sliding off the screen or whatever. We want to prevent that. So we're just going to click on constraints and then freeze the positions in X, Y, and Z, basically saying just leave the thing where it is. I don't want you to mess with it. And then I click save. I save my scene. And if you're stuck in this prefab menu, which we got to by double clicking on card 1, you can just find this little arrow back here in the hierarchy and click on it, and it'll go back to your game scene. And I click on my card 1, and all that stuff still lives here. Now I need to click on my drop zone. I can click on the drop zone prefab, and I need to add, I don't need a rigid body here. What I do need is a box collider 2D. And I'll double click on this one again, and I'll click Edit Collider. First, I want to see what the size of this thing is. It seems that it's 1501 by 194.5. So I'll hit Edit Collider. Actually, I don't need to do that. I just click 1501 by 194.5. Then I don't have to drag and drop anything. If I click Edit Collider here, you'll see that it's exactly the size of my my drop zone. And then I don't need to edit this anymore. I'll go back just to see my full scene. And I'll click play. Oop, not pause, I'll click play. And now I hit draw cards. And then, well, I have a bunch of red cards here, which I haven't added my drag drop script there. But if I drag my green one here around and then drop it, well, nothing happens. And why is that? Well, we'll see. I haven't done anything in my script to say what should happen when the collision happens. So I go back to my script, and it may seem like we're doubling back on a few things, and you'll find yourself doing that because a lot of times in Unity, you not only have to work something out in the editor, but you have to connect the dots in the script that's attached to the object, or vice versa. So now what we need to do is under the update method, we're going to add a private void on collision enter 2D, and that will auto-populate as taking the parameters collision 2D collision. This is just the syntax that Unity uses with this built-in function of on collision enter 2D. This simply means when there's a collision, a 2D collision between this object and another one, there's going to be a collision 2D, and Unity is calling it simply collision. You could change that name to anything you like. We're going to say right now there's only two things this can really collide with. It could collide with another card, I suppose, but right now it can only collide with a card which the script is attached to. It can only collide with the drop zone. So we're going to say when this collision happens, is over drop zone equals true. And the drop zone, this game object that we just declared up here, is equal to the collision game object. So when there's a collision between this card and the drop zone, and that's what this collision is called, we're going to set is over drop zone to true, and we're going to say this drop zone variable, we're going to make it equal to whatever game object is involved on the other side of this collision, which we know is the drop zone. And then after, but we want to make sure that if we drag over the drop zone and then we miss the drop zone, or we decide I don't want to place that card down, I want to choose another card, that means that I take the card away from the drop zone. I want to say private void on collision exit 2D, and then we have the same syntax here, is over drop zone is false. And this drop zone variable, well, it started out as null, and I want it to stay null. So that's that. So now, when I click play, and I hit draw cards, well, now I've got a bunch of green cards here. Again, we're having a little bit of trouble with this drop zone here, that it's appearing behind it. But when I drop it on the drop zone, it drops right in the middle, right there at the beginning of the grid. And then if I drop another one, well, nothing's happening because I did it wrong. So the more that I do this, the more that I see that there are little things that are not working for me. And we're going to take a look at exactly why right now. What's happening here is that I've got a mildly functioning game where I can drag half of the cards, the green cards, onto this drop zone, but I can't drag the red cards because I haven't attached the right script. And it's sort of working where I'm dropping this on the drop zone, but it's also seeming to be buggy in some ways, and there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is pretty easy to fix. Actually, both of them are easy to fix. The first one is that my player area, as you'll see here, is higher in the hierarchy than my drop zone. So I'm going to drag the drop zone above the player area and the enemy area. So now when I draw cards, it appears above the drop zone, just like that. And that's working a lot better. But I run into a problem here when I accidentally drag and drop over another card. It doesn't seem to work properly, or now these two cards are attached to one another. It kind of messes up. And that has to do with the collision layers that exist in the game. So let's clean this up a little bit. First of all, I'm going to go to my card 2, and I'm going to add a component. I'm going to add this script. I can actually just drag and drop this script, drag drop here, and then I'm going to add a component, which is the event trigger. And again, this is why you want to do this all beforehand with just one base game object or prefab, so you don't have to do this 100 times. And I'll add a new event type called begin drag. I'll add a new event type called end drag. I'll add things to that list. I'll drag this prefab, the card 2, to there so that I can access the script that's attached to it. I'll go to my drag drop script. I'll add start drag, and I'll add end drag. Okay, and then what else are we missing? We're missing the box collider 2D, which we want to set the size to be the same as this one, which is 120 by 177. We're going to add the rigid body 2D, basically doing the same thing, duplicating what we did before. We want it to have zero drag, zero gravity scale. We want it to be continuous. We want to freeze these positions. Okay, and then for both of these, we want to create a new layer, which is called cards. And the way that we do this is we go to card, we go to our card prefab, we go up to this this area right here under layer, and we just created it by saying add layer, but now I'm going to add this to cards. And then I'm going to go to the edit project settings, and under physics 2D I see this matrix here, this layer collision matrix, which says like, well, what should collide with what? And if I look at cards, I'm saying I don't want cards to collide with cards. I actually want them to be to not collide with each other. So I don't want Unity to detect collisions between these cards and give me an issue. And now when I click play and I click draw cards, I have a bunch of these randomized cards here. I can drag one here to the drop zone. It drops right there. I can drag a red card here, and it doesn't work. So let's figure out why that is. If I go back to this card 2 where I created that layer, I didn't actually assign it to that layer. So then now that I've assigned it to that layer, it should not collide with the other cards that are in the scene. So I click play. I click draw cards. I get a bunch of random cards. I drag and drop to the drop zone, and you notice that the cards are now above the drop zone. I can keep dropping, and look, I'll collide as much as I want, but the cards don't collide with one another. And I do this a couple more times. So now I'm just playing cards naturally as you would if you were playing a card game. So there's a few things outstanding that you might want to tinker with and see if you can make them even better than this. But by and large, now we have a fully functioning base 2D card game where I have a player area, I have an enemy area, I have a drop zone, I have a way to draw cards, and a script that's attached to this to randomize the cards as they appear on screen. I can drag these cards and drop them wherever I like, and if I don't drop them over a drop zone, they return back to their starting area. should mention that this is like a single player version of the card game, so we're not like adding networking support or allowing players to see their own hands but not see other players' hands, but the structure is there. There's still a few outstanding things, like if you wanted to add rounded edges to these cards, if you wanted to add images to these cards, or if you wanted to make it so that I can't actually bring them over to your hand area, so that because they're behind your hand area right now, or other functionality, or you only want people to be able to play one card at a time. Like, there's a lot of different things you could do with this. So I leave that up to you to make it better and more awesome, and definitely look better than this version of the game. But hopefully this is helpful to you in your creation of a 2D card game in Unity, and also just gaining experience with the scripting in Unity and checking out the canvas layers and some of the 2D features. Thanks so much for watching my video. I hope you found it helpful. If so, please like it and subscribe to my channel and check out my books, and we'll see you soon.